Why must a man chase the sunset? What fever burns in the soul that it forces him to wager his life, his honor, and the fate of generations on a single, impossible idea? In the late 15th century, the world believed it knew its limits. It was a flat, finite stage, bordered by monsters and boiling seas. But one man, a Genoese wool weaver's son with an ego as vast as the ocean he yearned to conquer, saw not an edge, but a shortcut. Cristoforo Colombo, or Christopher Columbus as he would become known, was not merely a dreamer, he was a salesman of obsession, a lobbyist for a fantasy. How did one man's colossal miscalculation of the Earth's circumference ignite the single greatest transformation in human history? His personal drama, a desperate quest for titles and gold, was merely the spark. The geopolitical intrigue was the powder keg. For years, he had been a courtly pest, a well-dressed madman peddling his enterprise of the Indies to the crowned heads of Europe, only to be met with scholarly scorn and polite dismissal. The Portuguese masters of the sea had already found their path to the Orient's riches, a painstaking, treacherous crawl around the continent of Africa. They had no need for a madman's shortcut. But in Spain, in the year of our Lord 1492, the air was thick with triumph and paranoia. The final Moorish kingdom of Granada had fallen. The centuries-long Reconquista was complete. Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon stood at a precipice. They had forged a new, fiercely Catholic nation from the crucible of holy war, but their treasury was empty, their people were restless, and their Portuguese rivals were growing richer by the day from the spice trade. Their kingdom was a hungry beast, and it needed to be fed. It was into this cauldron of ambition and anxiety that Columbus made his final, desperate pitch. He was no longer just an adventurer, he was the answer to a prayer they hadn't yet dared to utter. He offered not just a trade route, but a divine shortcut, a path to the gold of Cathay, the spices of the Indies, and the souls of the heathens, all for the glory of Spain and God. It was a gamble of epical proportions, a long shot backed by questionable science and boundless self-confidence. The Queen's scholars warned her that Columbus's numbers were fatally flawed, that the ocean was far wider than he claimed. They were, of course, absolutely correct. But Isabella was not listening to her academics. She was listening to the whispers of destiny and the louder roar of geopolitical necessity. Portugal's maritime dominance was a thorn in Spain's side, a constant reminder of their secondary status on the world stage. Columbus offered a chance to leapfrog them, to flank their African route with a direct westward dash to Asia. It was audacious, it was reckless, it was, for a monarchy that had just bet everything on religious and national unity, an almost irresistible proposition. The negotiations were brutal and protracted. Columbus, the son of a weaver, demanded the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the viceroyalty and governorship of all lands he should claim, and 10% of all revenues from those lands in perpetuity. These were not the requests of a humble explorer, they were the demands of a man who believed he was negotiating the terms of a new world order. He was a man forging his own myth in real time. The monarchs balked, dismissed him, then called him back. What choice did they have? The old world was exhausted, its paths to wealth blocked. The allure of a new, unknown path was too strong. They were not funding a scientific expedition, they were bankrolling a miracle. In the end, the deal was struck. A contract was signed at Santa Fe, a document that would become one of the most consequential pieces of paper in human history. It was a license for one man to chase a ghost, but it would unintentionally become the founding charter for a new age of empire. The Spanish crown, having just expelled its Jewish population and enforced a rigid Catholic orthodoxy at home, was now exporting its crusading spirit across the globe. The quest for gold was inextricably linked with the quest for souls. Profit and piety became the twin engines of this new era. It was a marriage of convenience between a man's bottomless ambition and an empire's desperate greed. A single voyage, intended to find a new way to the old world, was about to accidentally stumble upon a new one altogether. Columbus sought a path to the riches of the East, but found an entire hemisphere that would prove far heavier and far bloodier than all the gold in Cathay. He didn't know it, but he was not sailing toward a destination. He was sailing toward a collision. The world held its breath, though it did not know why. On the 3rd of August, 1492, 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, slipped out of the port of Palos de la Frontera. They were little more than wooden tubs, crewed by hardened sailors, and a handful of pardoned convicts, captained by a foreigner with a secret map in his head. The crew was terrified. They were sailing off the edge of the known world, into what the maps called the Sea of Darkness. Every day that the coast of Europe receded was another day closer to damnation. Columbus, however, was a master of manipulation. He kept 2 ship's logs, a fake one for the crew, showing shorter distances to quell their fears, and a real one for himself, charting his true, terrifying progress into the void. This small deception was a microcosm of the entire enterprise, a journey built on a foundation of half-truths, miscalculations, and unwavering, perhaps delusional, self-belief. What drives a man to such lengths to deceive his own men while staring into the abyss? The weeks turned into months. The sea was unnervingly calm, the winds strangely constant. There were false sightings of land, moments of elation followed by crushing disappointment. The mood on the ships soured. Mutiny was not a possibility, it was an inevitability. The sailors, pragmatic men of the sea, knew this was suicide. They were ready to turn back, to throw the mad Genoese overboard and save themselves. Columbus begged, cajoled, and threatened. He promised them riches beyond their wildest dreams. He appealed to their honor, to their duty to the Queen. He was, above all else, a performer, and this was the performance of his life. He staked everything on the conviction that land was just over the horizon. He had no proof. He had only faith, not in God, necessarily, but in himself. And then, in the pre-dawn hours of October 12th, a lookout on the Pinta, a man named Rodrigo de Triana, screamed the word they had all given up on: tierra, tierra, land. It was not the bustling ports of China or the Spice Islands of Japan. It was a small, flat island in what we now call the Bahamas, a world away from his intended destination. To the local Taíno people, who paddled out in their canoes to greet the strange floating houses, it was Guanahani. Columbus, in his first official act of cosmic misdirection, christened it San Salvador, the Holy Savior. He was convinced he had reached the outskirts of Asia, the Indies. He therefore called the gentle, near-naked people who greeted him Indians, a geographical error so profound that it has stuck for more than 500 years. The first encounter was one of mutual bewilderment. The Taíno, who had no concept of private property, metallurgy, or monarchy, saw beings who seemed to have descended from the heavens. Columbus and his men, who had no concept of a world outside the Eurasian power struggles, saw not a new civilization, but a new resource. They saw bodies to be enslaved and lands to be claimed. He wrote in his journal with a chilling pragmatism, "They are well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." The die was cast in those first few hours. This was not to be a meeting of equals. It was a preview of a conquest. The ships sailed on, hopping from island to island, from Cuba to Hispaniola. Everywhere they went, Columbus searched for the telltale signs of the great Asian civilizations described by Marco Polo. He looked for grand cities, for emperors in silk robes, for ports filled with spice-laden junks. All he found were small villages, complex societies living in harmony with a world he could not comprehend. And yet, he saw gold. Small pieces of it, worn as ornaments by the Taíno. This was the proof he needed. This was the key that would unlock the funding for a second, much larger expedition. The lust for this yellow metal would drive every decision from that point forward. He traded worthless glass beads and brass bells for priceless golden artifacts, a transaction that perfectly symbolized the relationship he was establishing. He was not there to learn or to trade, but to take. Before he left, a catastrophe struck. On Christmas Eve, the Santa Maria, his flagship, ran aground and was wrecked. The event was spun by Columbus as a sign from God that he should establish a permanent settlement. With the help of the local Taíno cacique, or chief, Guacanagari, his men salvaged the timbers of the ship and built a crude fort. He called it La Navidad, Christmas Town. He left 39 of his men behind with instructions to trade for as much gold as they could find, and sailed for Spain, a hero. He carried with him a small collection of gold trinkets, exotic parrots, strange plants, and a handful of kidnapped Taíno people to present at court as living proof of his discovery. His return to Spain was a triumph. He was no longer the madman, the court pest. He was Don Cristobal Colon, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of the Indies. He had sailed into the sunset and returned with a new world in his pocket. He presented his findings to Ferdinand and Isabella, painting a picture of an earthly paradise, a land of docile natives and bottomless reserves of gold just waiting to be claimed for Spain. He omitted the growing tensions, the fear in his men's eyes, and the simple fact that he had absolutely no idea where he actually was. He had discovered a world, but in his mind, it was merely a back door to another. The tragic irony is that Columbus discovered America, but he never saw it. His eyes were fixed on an Asian horizon that was not there. Was this the greatest discovery in history, or its most tragic misunderstanding? A question for you. Was Columbus a daring explorer who expanded our world, or a colossal failure who got lost and refused to admit it? Tell me your thoughts below. The wheels of history were turning, and the world he had stumbled upon was about to pay the price for his magnificent error. The 39 men he left at La Navidad were the first seeds of a European empire in the Americas, but seeds planted in greed and ignorance rarely grow into paradise. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola a year later in 1493, it was not as a lone explorer, but as a conqueror. He led a grand fleet of 17 ships carrying over 1,200 men. This was no voyage of discovery, it was an invasion force. There were no scholars or diplomats, only soldiers, ambitious hidalgos and priests, all eager for their share of the promised gold and glory. They arrived at the site of La Navidad expecting to find a bustling trading post, a fort piled high with gold. Instead, they found only silence. The fort was burned to the ground and all 39 Spaniards were dead. The local Taíno, initially so welcoming, told a story of rape, pillage, and murder. The sailors left behind had quickly descended into lawless brutality, stealing food, gold, and women, until the enraged Taíno, led by a rival cacique named Caonabo, had risen up and annihilated them. La Navidad was not a symbol of friendship. It was the first bloody scar on the face of the New World, a testament to the catastrophic failure of this first colonial experiment. The dream of peaceful coexistence had died before it had ever truly begun. Columbus's response was not one of reflection or caution, it was one of vengeance. He abandoned the ruins of La Navidad and moved eastward, establishing a new settlement he named La Isabela, in honor of his queen. It was the first formal European colony in the Americas, and it was a disaster from the start. Built on a swampy, malarial piece of coastline, the settlement was soon ravaged by disease and starvation. The promised mountains of gold failed to materialize. The colonists, who had come for easy riches, were forced into the humiliating labor of building a town. Discontent festered, turning quickly to open mutiny. Columbus, the brilliant navigator, proved to be an utterly incompetent governor. His leadership style was a toxic mix of autocratic arrogance, paranoia, and brutal repression. He responded to dissent with the whip, the gallows, and the chopping block. The paradise he had promised his patrons was rapidly devolving into a disease-ridden, famine-stricken penal colony, a hell on earth governed by a tyrant. The dream of the New World was dying in its cradle, and Columbus was its midwife. He was a man drowning in the consequences of his own success. Desperate to justify the massive expense of the expedition and to placate his increasingly angry colonists, he turned his fury on the Taíno. If he could not find gold mines, he would create wealth by other means. He initiated a series of brutal military campaigns into the island's interior, known as cabalgadas. These were not wars, they were slave raids. His heavily armed soldiers, with their steel swords, crossbows, and terrifying war dogs, tore through Taíno villages. They murdered, they raped, and they captured hundreds of people in chains. In 1495, he rounded up 1,600 Taíno and shipped 500 of them to the slave markets of Seville, a gift to his queen. Nearly half died on the torturous voyage. Isabella, to her credit, was horrified and ordered them returned, decreeing that her new subjects were not to be enslaved. But it was too late. The principle had been established. The indigenous people of this new world were not subjects to be protected, but commodities to be exploited. A new economic model was being born, one written in blood and tears. This was followed by the imposition of the infamous encomienda system. It was not officially slavery, but a form of feudal trusteeship. In reality, it was a license for genocide. Every Taíno over the age of 14 was required to provide a hawk's bell full of gold dust to the Spanish every 3 months. In areas with no gold, 25 pounds of spun cotton was required. It was an impossible tax, a demand designed to be failed. Those who failed to meet their quota had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death as a warning to others. This systematic terror shattered Taíno society. They were hunted, forced into slave labor in non-existent gold mines and on Spanish plantations. They fled to the mountains where they starved. They organized rebellions which were mercilessly crushed. Many resorted to mass suicide, poisoning themselves with cassava juice rather than live under Spanish rule. Mothers were known to have killed their own infants to spare them the fate that awaited them. The land that Columbus had described as an idyllic paradise was now a landscape of horror. The numbers tell a story more eloquent than any chronicle. Modern demographic estimates suggest that the population of Hispaniola in 1492 was anywhere from several 100,000 to over 1 million people. By 1514, a mere 2 decades later, a Spanish census recorded only 22,000 Taíno remaining. By the middle of the century, they were functionally extinct. This was not just a tragedy, it was a systematic extermination, the first large-scale genocide in the modern era. It was set in motion by the policies of one man, driven by his desperate need to deliver on his promise of gold. Columbus had sought a new world and, upon finding it, had immediately set about destroying it. The great discoverer had become the great destroyer. His quest for glory had unleashed a demographic catastrophe that would be repeated across 2 continents. He had opened Pandora's box, and the demons that flew out would haunt the Americas for centuries to come. The cruelty was not random, it was methodical. It was the cold logic of an enterprise that valued profit above human life. Eyewitness accounts, most famously from the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, paint a stomach-churning picture of the atrocities. He described infants being dashed against rocks, people being burned alive in groups of 13 in honor of Christ and his apostles, and Spanish soldiers making bets on who could split a man in 2 or decapitate him with a single sword stroke. They hunted natives for sport with their dogs. This was not the work of a few rogue soldiers. This was the accepted culture of the conquest. Las Casas, who had initially been an encomendero himself, spent the rest of his life documenting these horrors and lobbying the Spanish crown to end them. His writings, while perhaps prone to some exaggeration for rhetorical effect, remain a damning indictment of the colonial project's bloody dawn. He wrote, "Into this sheepfold, into this land of meek outcasts, there came some Spaniards who immediately behaved like ravening wild beasts, wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starved for many days." The gold rush, which had never truly begun, was over. What little surface gold the Taíno possessed was quickly confiscated. The Spanish found no great mines, no El Dorado. The entire brutal enterprise, the enslavement and murder of an entire people, had been for a pittance. The colony of La Isabela was a failure, a monument to greed and incompetence. Columbus, in a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation and find the mainland of Asia, embarked on further explorations of Cuba and Jamaica, but returned to Hispaniola empty-handed and seriously ill. He returned to a colony in open revolt. The paradise he had promised the crown was a charnel house, a failed state, bleeding money and lives. The colonists, cheated of their promised riches, were turning on each other and on the Columbus brothers, who governed with an iron fist. The admiral's dream was unraveling, thread by bloody thread. The man who had conquered the ocean was being consumed by the land he had claimed. The stage was set for his downfall. The reports flowing back to Spain were no longer tales of paradise, but horrifying accounts of mismanagement, tyranny, and chaos. The colonists wrote letters to the court complaining of the Columbus brothers' greed, their foreignness — they were Genoese, not Castilian — and their brutal discipline. They accused them of hiding gold from the crown and of ruling for their own benefit. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were pragmatic rulers. Their investment was failing. The admiral who had promised them a golden shortcut to the Indies had delivered only turmoil, expense, and a torrent of bad publicity. Their patience was wearing thin. The hero of the first voyage had become the villain of the second. The cheers that had greeted his triumphant return had faded, replaced by whispers of scandal and failure. He was losing control not only of his colony, but of his own legend. The forces he had unleashed were now turning against him, and the chains he had so freely used on others were about to be fitted for his own wrists. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The situation on Hispaniola had devolved into a full-blown civil war. The Spanish colonists, led by a man named Francisco Roldan, the island's former Chief Justice, had rebelled against the authority of Christopher's brothers, Bartholomew and Diego, who were left in charge while he was exploring. Roldan and his followers were not fighting for the rights of the Taíno. They were fighting for a larger share of the spoils. They accused the Columbus family of being cruel and despotic foreigners who were hoarding the island's wealth. They retreated to the interior of the island, effectively creating a rogue state, living among the Taíno and forming alliances with local caciques against the Columbus regime. When Columbus returned to Santo Domingo, the new capital he had established, he found his authority in tatters. He was no longer a viceroy in command, he was a faction leader in a dirty colonial war. He was forced to negotiate with the rebels, eventually offering them pardons, land, and the right to use native labor, a humiliating concession that further institutionalized the very system of exploitation he had created. The chaos was untenable. The Spanish crown could no longer ignore the deluge of complaints. In 1499, they made a fateful decision. They appointed a new governor, an officer of the military order of Calatrava named Francisco de Bobadilla, and gave him full authority to investigate the situation and restore order. Bobadilla arrived in Santo Domingo in August of 1500. He arrived to a shocking sight. The bodies of 7 rebellious Spaniards were hanging from the gallows, executed on the orders of Columbus. It was all the proof he needed. Bobadilla immediately took command of the island. He seized the Columbus family's property and began taking testimony from their many enemies. The stories he heard were of staggering cruelty, of arbitrary justice, and of a family that ruled the island like a private fiefdom, enriching themselves at the expense of both the colonists and the crown. Bobadilla, acting on his authority, made a decision that would echo through history. He ordered the arrest of Christopher Columbus and his 2 brothers. The scene was one of ultimate humiliation. The man who had been given the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the man who had dined with kings and queens, was arrested like a common thief. Soldiers came to his residence and placed him in chains. Columbus, ever the master of theatrical gestures, reportedly did not resist. He told the soldiers to put the shackles on him, saying he would wear them as a badge of honor, a symbol of the shabby reward he had received for his service to Spain. It was a calculated move, an attempt to frame himself as a martyr. But the reality was undeniable. He was a prisoner. He was shipped back to Spain in chains, the clanking of the iron a constant, rhythmic reminder of his fall from grace. The great discoverer, the man who had redrawn the map of the world, was returning home in disgrace, accused of being a tyrant and a failure. He had discovered a world he could not rule, and it had broken him. What a profound irony. The man who began the age of mass enslavement in the Americas ended his own tenure as governor in bondage. The voyage home was a long and bitter one. He wrote a lengthy, self-pitying letter to a friend at court, lamenting his fate and protesting his innocence. When he arrived in Cadiz, the sight of the celebrated admiral in chains caused a public sensation and no small amount of embarrassment for the crown. Ferdinand and Isabella, unwilling to be seen as ungrateful to the man who had given them an empire, ordered him released and summoned him to court. They stripped him of his title as governor. He would never again hold political power in the lands he had claimed, but they allowed him to keep his titles of admiral and viceroy, now hollow honors. They even agreed to fund a fourth voyage, a last-ditch attempt for him to finally find the passage to Asia that he still delusionally believed was just beyond the next island. But it was a consolation prize. The great enterprise was no longer his. While he had been forging his little kingdom of cruelty, others were already capitalizing on his discovery, launching their own voyages and carving out their own claims. The door he had opened was now being stormed by a host of ruthless competitors. His disgrace marked the end of the first chapter of the Age of Discovery and the beginning of a far larger, more cynical, and more violent era. His personal tragedy was merely the prologue to a continental one. What do you think this moment represents? Was the Crown's decision to arrest him an act of morality against a tyrant, or a cold act of politics to remove a liability? Let me know your verdict in the comments. While Columbus languished first in a Spanish prison and then in political irrelevance, the world he had unleashed was spinning out of control. His discovery had not just revealed new lands, it had ignited a geopolitical firestorm between the two great maritime powers of the age, Spain and Portugal. Portugal, which had painstakingly pioneered the sea route around Africa under the visionary leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, saw Spain's westward lunge as a direct threat to its hard-won monopoly on the Asian trade. They had their own claims, backed by papal bulls that granted them dominion over any new lands discovered along their route. Columbus's voyage and the audacious claims of the Spanish crown that followed threw all of this into question. An Atlantic war between the two Catholic superpowers seemed not just possible, but imminent. The fate of the world hung in the balance, to be decided not by navigators, but by diplomats and popes. The arena for this conflict was not the high seas, but the corridors of power at the Vatican. The Pope at the time was the infamous Rodrigo Borgia, who had taken the name Alexander VI. A Spaniard by birth, he was a man known more for his political cunning, his nepotism, and his decadent lifestyle than for his spiritual leadership. He was the perfect arbiter for a dispute based on power, not piety. In a series of papal bulls in 1493, most notably Inter Caetera, Alexander sought to mediate the dispute. He drew an imaginary line of demarcation on the map of the world, running from the North Pole to the South Pole, 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. All lands to the west of this line, discovered or yet to be discovered, would belong to Spain. All lands to the east would belong to Portugal. It was perhaps the single most arrogant act in the history of geopolitics. With a stroke of a pen, a single man in Rome had presumed to divide the entire non-Christian world between two European kingdoms. The Portuguese, naturally, were furious. The line was too far east, threatening their ambitions in the South Atlantic and potentially cutting them off from the route to India they were so close to finalizing. King John II of Portugal entered into direct, tense negotiations with Ferdinand and Isabella. This was a high-stakes game of diplomatic chess, with spies, cartographers, and ambassadors as the key players. The Portuguese argued, cajoled, and threatened, bringing their superior knowledge of Atlantic geography to bear. The result was the landmark Treaty of Tordesillas, signed on June 7, 1494. The two kingdoms agreed to move the Pope's line westward to a new position, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Neither side knew for certain what lay on either side of this new line. They were dividing a world they had not yet mapped, but the Portuguese had a suspicion. Their secret voyages down the African coast had given them an understanding of the Atlantic winds and currents. They knew that a ship sailing to the Cape of Good Hope needed to swing far to the west, into the South Atlantic. They gambled that this new, more westerly line might just encompass a piece of the great southern landmass they suspected was there. Their gamble paid off spectacularly. In the year 1500, the Portuguese navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral, officially on his way to India, swung his fleet far out into the Atlantic and discovered the coast of Brazil. Miraculously, the territory he landed on fell just east of the Tordesillas line. To the Spanish, it looked like an accident. To historians, it looked suspiciously like the Portuguese knew exactly what they were doing. The world had now been officially partitioned. This treaty, a relic of a bygone era of papal authority, would have profound and lasting consequences. It is the reason why Brazil today is a Portuguese-speaking nation in a sea of Spanish-speaking countries. It is the reason why the Philippines, far in the east, became a Spanish colony, as it fell on their side of the line when it was extended around the globe. It was the birth of global politics, the moment when European power struggles were projected onto the entire planet. The Treaty of Tordesillas did more than just prevent a war between Spain and Portugal. It created a legal and theological justification for colonialism. It enshrined the doctrine of discovery, the idea that Christian nations had the right, even the duty, to claim and conquer non-Christian lands. The indigenous inhabitants of these lands were not seen as sovereign peoples with rights of their own. They were simply part of the landscape, objects to be subjugated, converted, or eliminated. The treaty was a starting gun for a new kind of empire, the overseas colonial empire. It transformed the random acts of discovery into a systematic project of conquest and exploitation. The personal ambition of Columbus had been swallowed up by the imperial ambitions of the state. He had been the catalyst, but the reaction was now far beyond his control. While these grand geopolitical maneuvers were taking place, a new generation of adventurers was being drawn to the world Columbus had unveiled. They were a different breed from the sailors of the first voyage. They were younger, more ruthless, and they had no illusions about finding a shortcut to Asia. They were there for gold, land, and glory, and they were willing to achieve it by any means necessary. They were the conquistadors. They saw the New World not as a place for settlement or trade, but as a battlefield, a place to win fortune with the sword. Columbus had opened the door, and now a legion of dragons was pouring through. The age of discovery was over. The age of conquest had begun, and the blueprint for this conquest, the license to kill and to claim, had been signed and sealed at Tordesillas. The division of the world on paper was about to be written in blood across the Americas. The men who followed in Columbus's wake were the hardened products of the Reconquista, soldiers who had spent their lives fighting the Moors and now found themselves unemployed. The New World offered them a new holy war, a new frontier where they could apply their brutal trade. They were not explorers in any meaningful sense. They were military entrepreneurs, gambling their lives for a chance at godlike wealth. The most infamous of these was a minor nobleman from Extremadura, a man of cunning, courage, and breathtaking cruelty, Hernán Cortés. In 1519, he landed on the coast of Mexico with a force of just 500 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. His target was a prize beyond Columbus's wildest dreams, the mighty Aztec Empire, a sophisticated, wealthy, and warlike civilization that dominated the region from its magnificent capital city of Tenochtitlan, a shimmering metropolis built on an island in the middle of a lake. On paper, Cortés's mission was suicide. He was facing an empire of millions with a handful of soldiers, but he had advantages the Aztecs could not comprehend. Cortés was a master of psychological warfare and political manipulation. He exploited the Aztecs' own legends of a pale-skinned, bearded god, Quetzalcoatl, who was prophesied to return from the east. He skillfully turned the Aztecs' subjugated vassal states against them, forging alliances with disgruntled tribes who were tired of paying tribute in gold and human lives to their overlords in Tenochtitlan. His most crucial asset was his translator and consort, a native woman known as La Malinche or Doña Marina, who helped him navigate the complex political landscape. The story of the conquest of Mexico is a masterpiece of audacity. Cortés scuttled his own ships to ensure there was no retreat. He marched his tiny army through jungles and over mountains, directly into the heart of the empire. The Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II, unsure if he was facing gods or men, welcomed Cortés into Tenochtitlan, a fatal act of hospitality. Cortés repaid him by taking him hostage, attempting to rule the empire through its captive king. The city eventually erupted in violence. During the chaotic Spanish retreat known as La Noche Triste, the Sad Night, hundreds of Spaniards were killed. But Cortés did not give up. He regrouped, built a fleet of small warships to control the lake, and laid siege to the city. The final battle for Tenochtitlan was an apocalyptic struggle. It was a clash of two worlds, of two different conceptions of warfare. The Spanish fought to kill and to conquer territory. The Aztecs, for whom warfare was a ritualized act, often sought to capture enemies for sacrifice. In the end, it was not steel that proved to be the decisive weapon. It was disease. A single Spanish soldier in Cortés's party was carrying smallpox. The virus swept through the besieged city, a biological firestorm against which the Aztecs had no immunity. It killed more people than any sword, wiping out up to half the population, including the new emperor. Weakened by disease and starvation, the city fell in August of 1521 after a brutal 3-month siege. The Spanish and their native allies slaughtered the survivors and razed the magnificent city to the ground. On its ruins, they would build Mexico City. An empire had been toppled by a handful of adventurers, a feat made possible by a combination of technological superiority, political cunning, and a microscopic, unintentional ally. The gold of the Aztecs, melted down from priceless works of art into crude bullion, began its long journey to the coffers of Spain. A decade later, the same brutal drama played out far to the south, in the Andes Mountains of Peru. There, another conquistador, the illiterate and ruthless Francisco Pizarro, set his sights on the even larger and wealthier Inca Empire. The Inca civilization was a marvel of engineering and social organization, a vast empire connected by a sophisticated road system, ruling over millions of subjects. But Pizarro arrived at a moment of perfect weakness. The empire had just been ravaged by a civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, and, more devastatingly, by the same smallpox epidemic that had helped Cortés, which had spread south ahead of the Spanish themselves. Pizarro, with a force of just 168 men, marched into the heart of the empire. In a stunning act of treachery at the city of Cajamarca, he invited the victorious Inca emperor, Atahualpa, to a meeting. As Atahualpa arrived in his royal litter, surrounded by thousands of unarmed retainers, Pizarro's men sprang their trap. Their hidden cannons fired, their cavalry charged, and they massacred the panicked Inca nobility. Pizarro himself seized Atahualpa. The capture of a living god, the Sapa Inca, paralyzed the empire. Atahualpa, in a desperate bid for freedom, offered a ransom that defies belief. He promised to fill a large room once with gold and twice with silver within 2 months. Pizarro agreed. For weeks, a river of treasure poured into Cajamarca from every corner of the empire. Golden plates, silver goblets, intricate jewelry, life-sized statues. It was the greatest ransom in the history of the world. Once the room was filled, Pizarro, in a final act of perfidy, had Atahualpa put on trial for treason and heresy. He was found guilty and executed by garrote. With their leader gone, the Inca Empire, despite fierce resistance that would last for decades, fell into chaos. The Spanish captured the capital of Cuzco and began the systematic plunder of a civilization. The conquistadors did not just conquer empires, they decapitated them, leaving them to bleed to death. Columbus had been the scout, but these men were the executioners. They were the fulfillment of the dark promise of his discovery. The Age of Wonder was now fully and irrevocably an age of terror. The stories of Cortés and Pizarro are often told as epics of daring and military genius, the triumph of a few brave Europeans against overwhelming odds. But this is a carefully constructed myth. The reality is that the great empires of the Americas were not conquered. They collapsed. They were brittle structures, weakened from within by political divisions and from without by a force far more deadly than any Spanish sword. The true conquistador was not a man in armor. It was an invisible enemy, a microscopic organism that sailed across the Atlantic, hidden in the bodies of the invaders. The single greatest weapon of the European conquest was not gunpowder, but germs. The clash of civilizations was first and foremost a clash of disease pools. It was a biological war, and one side was utterly defenseless. The peoples of the Americas had lived in biological isolation for at least 15,000 years. During that time, the inhabitants of Europe, Asia, and Africa had been swapping pathogens for millennia, living in close proximity to domesticated animals, pigs, cattle, sheep, chickens, which were the original source of many of humanity's most virulent diseases: measles, smallpox, influenza, typhus, diphtheria. These were diseases that had swept through the Old World in devastating plagues, but over centuries, the surviving populations had developed genetic resistance and antibodies. They were common childhood illnesses for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had no history of these diseases and very few domesticated animals. They were a death sentence. This phenomenon is known as a virgin soil epidemic, and it is the single most important factor in understanding the European conquest of the New World. It was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. When the first European ships arrived, they were not just carrying men and supplies, they were floating biological time bombs. Smallpox was the most vicious of these killers. From its introduction in Hispaniola and Mexico, it spread like wildfire across the two continents, often moving faster than the Europeans themselves, transmitted along native trade routes. An entire village could be wiped out before its inhabitants had ever laid eyes on a white man. The symptoms were horrific: high fever, vomiting, and then the eruption of painful, fluid-filled pustules all over the body. It killed, on average, 30% of those it infected and left survivors scarred and often blind. Measles and influenza, while less lethal, also swept through in deadly waves. The combined effect was an apocalypse. Modern estimates suggest that in the century and a half following Columbus's first voyage, the indigenous population of the Americas plummeted by as much as 90 to 95%. This is a staggering figure. It means that for every 20 people, 19 died. It is a number so large it is almost impossible to comprehend. This great dying was not just a collection of individual tragedies, it was the collapse of entire societies. The plagues killed everyone: the common people, the farmers, the warriors, and, crucially, the leaders and the elders who held the community's knowledge and traditions. Social structures disintegrated, agricultural systems failed, leading to mass starvation. The psychological impact was just as devastating. How do you explain a disease that kills your people but leaves the strange newcomers untouched? To many, it seemed as though their own gods had abandoned them, and the god of the invaders was all-powerful. This spiritual despair shattered their will to resist. The conquest was not just military, it was biological and psychological. The great temples were not just pulled down, they were emptied by a power that could not be seen or fought. This vast continental die-off is the silent, terrible secret at the heart of the European settlement of the Americas. The vast, empty lands the colonists later claimed were not empty by nature, they were emptied by disease. This process is known to history as the Columbian Exchange. It is a neutral-sounding term for a profoundly unequal transaction. While the Americas were being ravaged by old world diseases, they were also exporting a treasure trove of new plants and animals that would revolutionize life on other continents. From the New World came potatoes, maize, corn, tomatoes, chili peppers, vanilla, cacao, the source of chocolate, and tobacco. The introduction of the potato to Europe, in particular, would have a massive demographic impact. This hardy, calorie-rich tuber could grow in poor soil and led to a population boom that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Maize had a similar effect in Africa and China. The world's diet and its population was fundamentally and permanently changed. The Old World also sent its own species to the New. Horses, pigs, cattle, and sheep were introduced to the Americas, where they transformed the landscape and native cultures. The horse, in particular, revolutionized life for the peoples of the Great Plains, creating the iconic buffalo hunting cultures of the 19th century. But this exchange was fatally lopsided. The New World gave the Old World sustenance and new sources of wealth. The Old World gave the New World death on an unimaginable scale. It was the greatest biological exchange in the history of the planet, but it was also an act of unwitting biological warfare. Was this exchange a natural, if tragic, consequence of two worlds meeting, or was it the ultimate unspoken weapon of conquest? A difficult question. Let me know your opinion. Was it a biological tragedy, or was it de facto biological warfare? The catastrophic decline of the native population created a severe labor crisis for the emerging colonial economies. The Spanish and Portuguese had come to the Americas not to work, but to get rich. Their economic model was based on exploitation, forcing native people to labor in mines and on plantations. But now their workforce was gone, wiped out by disease and brutal overwork. In the gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru, and especially on the sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean islands, a new source of labor was needed. The solution they found was as cynical as it was cruel, and it would give rise to one of the most monstrous institutions in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. The suggestion, ironically, was championed by some of the very people, like Bartolomé de las Casas, who had argued to protect the Indians. In a tragic miscalculation, they proposed importing enslaved laborers from Africa, arguing they were more resistant to disease and better suited to the hard labor. They could not have imagined the scale of the horror they were helping to unleash. Thus began the triangular trade, a brutal and highly profitable economic system that would dominate the Atlantic world for nearly 400 years. The first leg of the triangle involved ships sailing from European ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes, carrying manufactured goods, textiles, rum, and most importantly, firearms, to the coast of West Africa. There, these goods were traded to African kings and merchants for captured human beings. The second leg, the infamous Middle Passage, was the horrific journey of these enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas, packed into the holds of slave ships in conditions of unimaginable filth and cruelty. Chained together, lying in their own waste, millions of men, women, and children endured a voyage of weeks or months. Disease was rampant. The mortality rate was astronomical, with an estimated 15 to 25% dying on the journey. The bodies of the dead were simply thrown overboard to the sharks that constantly followed the ships. It was a journey into the heart of human darkness. Upon arrival in the New World, the traumatized survivors were sold at auction in ports like Charleston, Havana, and Salvador da Bahia. They were treated not as human beings, but as chattel, as livestock, branded and inspected like animals. They were then put to work on the vast sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations that were the economic engines of the colonial empires. The third leg of the triangle completed the circuit. The ships, now laden with the products of slave labor, sailed back to Europe, generating immense profits for investors, shipbuilders, and factory owners. This system was the foundation of the modern global economy. The wealth that built the grand cities of Europe, funded its universities, and financed the Industrial Revolution was extracted from the blood, sweat, and suffering of millions of enslaved Africans. The new world that Columbus had stumbled upon was now being built on a foundation of African bones. The scale of this forced migration was immense. Over the course of the slave trade, it is estimated that some 12.5 million Africans were loaded onto slave ships. Over 10.5 million survived the Middle Passage to be sold into bondage in the Americas. This was the largest forced migration in history. It was a crime against humanity on a scale that beggars belief. To justify this barbarity, a new and poisonous ideology was developed: racism. To treat other human beings as property, it was first necessary to dehumanize them. European and American thinkers, scientists, and theologians developed elaborate theories about the supposed biological and intellectual inferiority of African people. They were portrayed as savage, childlike, and uniquely suited for enslavement. This racist ideology was not the cause of slavery, it was its consequence. It was the intellectual scaffolding constructed to hold up a brutal economic system. The legacy of this ideology, born to justify the profits of the plantation, continues to poison societies to this day. The chains of slavery were not just physical, they were mental, and they have proven to be the hardest of all to break. Columbus did not invent slavery, but the world he created gave rise to its most industrialized and racially based form. His quest for gold in the Caribbean had led, by a relentless and terrible logic, to the enslavement of an entire continent. The Age of Discovery had created an economy of death. For centuries, this brutal history was largely ignored, whitewashed, or even celebrated. The figure of Christopher Columbus, in particular, underwent a remarkable transformation. The incompetent governor who died in obscurity, convinced he had found Asia, was resurrected and remade into a heroic icon. This process reached its apex not in Spain, but in a nation with which Columbus had no direct connection whatsoever: the United States of America. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, the young American Republic was searching for a national identity, a history of its own that was distinct from its British colonial past. They needed a founding father who wasn't British. Columbus, the Genoese mariner sailing for Spain, was the perfect candidate. He was an outsider, a visionary who had challenged the old order. He could be fashioned into a symbol of the American spirit of enterprise, discovery, and rugged individualism. The process of myth-making began in earnest. One of the key architects of the Columbus myth was the American author Washington Irving. His 1828 biography, A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, was a runaway bestseller. It was also a masterpiece of historical fiction masquerading as fact. Irving portrayed Columbus as a lone, heroic genius battling against the ignorance and superstition of medieval Europe. Most famously, Irving popularized the completely false story that Columbus was trying to prove the Earth was round to a cabal of flat earthers. In reality, every educated person in Columbus's day knew the Earth was a sphere. The debate was only about its size. But the image of the brave visionary fighting against backwardness was too compelling to resist. It was a story that flattered the young, forward-looking American nation. Irving conveniently glossed over Columbus's tyranny as a governor, his role in the slave trade, and the genocide he unleashed on the Taíno. The Columbus of history was replaced by the Columbus of legend. This new, sanitized Columbus became a powerful symbol in American culture. Cities, rivers, and even a nation, Columbia, were named after him. The nation's capital was placed in the District of Columbia. The myth was particularly embraced by Catholic immigrants, especially Italians and Irish, who were facing intense discrimination in the largely Protestant United States. By championing Columbus, an Italian Catholic who had discovered America, they could stake their own claim to the American story. He became their hero, a way to prove that they were not foreign interlopers, but foundational members of the nation. The creation of Columbus Day as a national holiday was the culmination of this process. It began as a one-time celebration in 1792 to mark the 300th anniversary of his voyage. In the late 19th century, after a mass lynching of 11 Italian Americans in New Orleans, the proclamation of Columbus Day was used by President Benjamin Harrison as a gesture of goodwill toward Italy and a way to calm diplomatic tensions. It became a federal holiday in 1937, a political act solidifying the myth of the heroic founder. The hero factory was in full production. Textbooks, statues, and public ceremonies all reinforced the same story. Columbus, the brave navigator, the bringer of civilization, the man who opened the new world to the light of progress. His ships were depicted as bringing the cross to a dark and savage land. The immense violence, the enslavement, the disease, all of it was erased from the official narrative. It was a classic case of creating a usable past. History was not being remembered, it was being curated. A complex, deeply flawed, and ultimately tragic historical figure was flattened into a two-dimensional cartoon hero. This act of historical sanitization served a powerful ideological purpose. It justified the European conquest of the Americas, portraying it not as a brutal invasion, but as a noble, civilizing mission. It allowed the United States to build its national identity on a foundation of discovery and progress, while burying the ugly truths of genocide and slavery that were its actual cornerstones. For generations, this was the only story that was told. The voices of the victims were silent, their histories erased. But history, like the land itself, has a long memory. The lie could not last forever. The carefully constructed myth of Columbus the hero began to crumble in the latter half of the 20th century. The civil rights movement in the United States created a new consciousness about the brutalities of racism and the importance of re-examining history from the perspective of its victims. Native American activists, in particular, began to challenge the celebratory narrative of Columbus. For them, he was not a hero. He was the man who had initiated the invasion of their lands and the genocide of their people. The 500th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage, in 1992, became a major flashpoint in this cultural war. While official celebrations were planned, a powerful counter-movement emerged, staging protests and educational campaigns under the slogan, 500 Years of Resistance. They argued that celebrating Columbus was celebrating conquest, slavery, and genocide. The quincentennial was not a party, it was a crime scene. This reassessment gained momentum in the academic world as well. Historians, drawing on new archaeological evidence and a more critical reading of the primary sources, including Columbus's own journals, began to paint a much darker and more complex picture of the man and his legacy. The heroic myth was dismantled piece by piece, revealing the brutal reality that lay beneath. The information began to seep into the public consciousness. The idea that Columbus discovered a continent that was already home to tens of millions of people was rightly ridiculed. The term "the New World" was exposed for what it was, a purely Eurocentric concept that erased the existence of the hemisphere's original inhabitants. People began to talk about the Columbian Exchange not as a neutral event, but as a biological catastrophe for the Americas. The sanitized hero of the 19th century was being replaced by the tyrant and slave trader of the 15th. The battle over the memory of Columbus has intensified in the 21st century, moving from academic debates into the streets. Across the country and around the world, a movement has grown to abolish Columbus Day and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day, a holiday to honor the history and contributions of the native peoples of the Americas. Dozens of cities and a growing number of states have made the change, a symbolic act of historical truth-telling. The most visible front in this war for memory has been the battle over statues. For decades, monuments to Columbus, often erected by Italian-American communities in the early 20th century, stood unquestioned in public parks and squares. Now they are seen by many as offensive symbols of colonialism and white supremacy. Protesters have doused them in red paint to symbolize blood, and in many cases have toppled them altogether. The images of these statues being pulled from their pedestals are powerful symbols of a society grappling with its own history. This is not, as critics claim, an attempt to erase history. It is an attempt to tell a fuller, more honest version of it. The fall of these statues represents the fall of an old narrative. It is the end of a story in which history is written solely by the victors. It is the assertion that the descendants of the conquered, the enslaved, and the marginalized also have a right to define the past and shape public memory. The debate over Columbus is not really about one man who lived 500 years ago. It is about us. It is about what kind of society we want to be. Do we celebrate conquerors, or do we remember the victims of conquest? Do we cling to comforting myths, or do we have the courage to face the complex and often painful truths of our history? Columbus did not act alone. He was a product of his time, a man driven by the ambitions and prejudices of his age. But his actions set in motion a chain of events that irrevocably and often brutally reshaped the entire world. He remains a pivotal figure, not because he was a hero, but because he stands at the epicenter of a historical earthquake whose aftershocks we are still feeling today. The statues may fall, but the questions they represent remain. The final battle is not over the past. It is a battle for the soul of the present, a struggle to decide which stories we tell ourselves about who we are.